I also tried to think in terms of incremental steps. So if I can't get from A to Z in one leap, are there interim experiences that get me closer to where I want to be? Because, if I set out from London walking east 100 steps every day, I will eventually get to China, right?
Hey there, I'm Goli Kalkaran, and this is Lessons from a Quitter, where we believe that it's never too late to start over. No matter how much time or money you've spent getting to where you are, if ultimately you are not happy, then it's time to get out. If you're feeling stuck and you feel like there's gotta be more, there's gotta be a way to feel fulfilled and excited about what you do, then this is the podcast for you. Each week, I will sit down with an inspiring guest who quit their professional career in order to forge their own path and create a life that they love. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lessons from a Quitter. Welcome to the new year, 2020, the first episode of 2020. I'm so excited to jump into this year with you. I'm really hoping to make the podcast more actionable and to give more tips and tricks and everything that I can to help you really take action in 2020 and beyond, and not just listen for inspiration. Although inspiration is great, I'm really all about trying to figure out how you can be in a career that you actually love. So to that end, if you have any suggestions, if there are things that you would like to see from the podcast, from the community, if there are things that will help you, let me know. I'm happy to incorporate as much as I can into this and to really create it in a way that's going to be helpful. With that said, as I mentioned in the last episode, we will be doing one book every month because I do think that books and podcasts are really the easiest way to work on the mindset piece, which is such a critical piece. I think shifting the way you think about your identity and what is possible and the right way of going about tackling your fears and anxieties and doubts and all that stuff is really what you need help with. Everything else is just kind of the 20%. So we're going to start in 2020 doing a book a month, and I will discuss what book it'll be in the beginning of the month, and then we'll do an episode at the end of the month kind of discussing it. So I hope you choose to follow along and read the book so that you can get a better understanding of the episode where we go in depth with it. The first month is The 4-Hour Work Week. It really is the book that kind of changed my mindset and the way I viewed work. And it really kind of started me on this personal development journey. And so I'm so excited to kind of revisit it after like 5 years now. So if you don't have it, you can pick it up anywhere you buy books. I have all the books that I'm going to recommend will be on the website under resources. 4-Hour Work Week is there too. So you could just go there and get it from the link or get it the audiobook. And we will discuss it towards the end of the month. One other thing I wanted to talk about before we jump into this episode is that I think a lot of times what stops us from taking that next step, uncertainty brings up a lot of fear in us. And I think that so often people don't take any steps because they don't know what lies ahead, which you never can, even if you plan, even if you think it through, which you should. There's no guarantee of the outcome. And so we end up staying stuck. And so often I hear people worry about how hard it's going to be or how uncomfortable it's going to be. If it doesn't work, how difficult that part of it is going to be. And again, a lot of this stuff is mindset and it's just a reframe. But one of the things I want you to think about is that it's going to be uncomfortable either way, right? You're clearly listening to this podcast because you are not happy in the career that you're in. So think about how uncomfortable it'll be if you're in the same career for 10 more years or 20 more years or 30 more years. Think about how unhappy you are now and compound that year after year after year. And maybe that's a duller pain. Maybe, I know there's the phrase, better the devil you know than the devil you don't. And so often we live by that because we're not consciously reevaluating our decisions and our thoughts. And the reality of it is that that's not true because we make the devil that we don't know so big. It doesn't have to be that way. And even that is all of your thoughts, how you approach it, how hard you think it is how much you're trying to white knuckle it, as opposed to like just accepting that there are going to be problems and there are going to be challenges and you're going to figure it out and you're going to work through it and you're going to figure out the next step. We get stuck in clinging to what we know. I think what helps me a lot of times when I get stuck with that, when I don't want to push out of that comfort zone, I think about like, I'm going to be uncomfortable either way. And so why not do something where I know the opportunity costs that I'm going to give up by not doing it are greater? Or put another way, like why not do something where there is the opportunity of me being abundantly more happy and more fulfilled and growing as a person by trying it, as opposed to staying stagnant and stuck and miserable and depressed in the thing that I know I don't like. So yes, it's scary. Yes, the fear doesn't go away. And this is actually a good segue into the episode today because we get into this with Marc. Look at what you're going to look back on your life and what you would regret. And I think that we don't tend to look at ourselves from that future self perspective. I mean, we know that we're going to get older, but we don't really think about like, what am I going to think when I'm 75 and I look back at my life? And so I think it's important to think about that in making these decisions and thinking like, if I'm going to be going through hard things, do I want to be in this place that I already know I don't want to be? Would I rather stay here and deal with the uncomfortableness and the pain and whatever is going to come by being somewhere that I'm not happy? Or am I willing to be uncomfortable in order to go after something that I believe can be better for me and that can fulfill me more? So as you start making your goals for this year and you start pondering what you're going to do in 2020, I want you to reframe the thought of how difficult it's going to be or how scary it's going to be or how bad it's going to be or whatever all these doomsday thoughts we have about changing our lives, and kind of reframe it into an adventure that is going to be much less uncomfortable than staying stagnant. So that was just my little tip for reframing some of the thoughts that we all tend to have about making new change in this new year. And with that, I want to jump into the episode with Marc Allen. I'm so excited to have him here. Marc spent 4 years at a major corporate law firm in the UK before quitting in 2015 with no real plan. He had taken 2 thought-provoking trips, one to Iran and one to New Orleans, that made it clear to him that he didn't want to spend his life being a lawyer, and he began planning out his next move. When he left, he spent 2 years trying out a variety of careers and building his online passion project called The Great Everything. And in 2017, he became a strategy consultant for a firm in Paris where he served a range of clients in the social impact space. In 2019, he became the engagement manager at Camber Collective, where he manages strategy and coalition design for companies, countries, funds, and philanthropies looking to outsize their social impact. He basically helps companies figure out how their philanthropical giving can be maximized. And we talk a lot about how his background in law and his other experiences really paved the way to this career, and how people can start looking at those skills that they've acquired, even if it's not what they're going to continue with, to serve them in their next project. He now helps other young professionals kind of through this process of self-reinvention and purpose-seeking. And he just has some really great advice about giving yourself that space and figuring out what the next thing is. So without further ado, let's jump in and talk to Marc. Hi, Marc. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I'm very happy to be here and to help support your excellent work with this podcast.
Oh, you're so kind. I'm so excited to have you here. And, I know you listen to the podcast, so you know that we start kind of at the beginning. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what led you to be a lawyer and what your career as a lawyer looked like?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think like a lot of people, I graduated from college in the UK, as you can probably hear, at the age of 21, and without much of a very clear idea of what I wanted to be when I grew up, but with the realization that I was growing up. And so decisions had to be made. And I think I'd always been attracted to law when I was at university because I was attracted to the idea of trying to convince people, of trying to bring about a change in people's view of a particular issue. And frankly, I'd looked at a whole bunch of career options through internships. I'd looked at political consulting, working with political parties on their campaigning. I'd looked at development, trying to change the narrative around development around the world. And I hadn't found anything that fit perfectly. And I thought, let's give law a go. My sister, who's 7 years older than me, was already a lawyer. She warned me not to do it, but I ignored her. And that's how I ultimately went down the law path for a good 4 years.
Yeah, I always wonder about that when people that do have lawyers in their family, because I never had any really in, close family or friends. So I didn't really understand what lawyers do at a day-to-day. And it's always fascinating to me for people that know lawyers and still choose to go into the profession.
Yeah, no, absolutely. She would tell me now that she told me all along not to do it. Yeah. But what can you say?
I know.
The revolting younger brother.
I love that. Okay, so you decided to go into law and what, tell us a little bit about what that looked like for you once you came out of law school.
Being a lawyer felt very different to being at law school, which initially was a relief because I had hated every minute of law school. And, I learned some super valuable things from being an attorney. I was at a very big firm. So I think, first and foremost, I learned how to work really, really hard. And, to develop that kind of backbone that I hadn't really nurtured at university. I think I learned how to navigate difficult internal power dynamics to make sure that I got the opportunities I wanted, which for me was having the chance to work in Paris for a while and to join the team that I wanted to specialize with. And, just the classic lawyer skill set that I think is super useful in a range of contexts, like researching, distilling information, presenting things in a compelling way, the drill. So, it was great. And I was lucky to be at a firm that was, kind of the global leader in the field I was most interested in, which was international law and public policy. So I think in those senses, I'm grateful I got that experience. On the flip side, I really struggled from day one with just how unimportant and kind of meaningless a lot of the work felt relative to the sort of deep seriousness that everybody treated it with. And I struggled with just, not being connected enough to the outcomes of the work. I think a lot of commercial lawyers convince themselves that they do it for the intellectual stimulation and, the thrill of servicing the client. But I have my doubts about the veracity of that.
I love a couple of things that you just said. I think so often a lot of people, we've talked a lot about the sunk cost fallacy, and a lot of people feel like, oh, I've wasted all this time. I wanted to be a lawyer. And I just like that you kind of broke down a lot of the skills. Maybe if you leave and you're not doing actual legal work, like what law school has taught you are things that are very valuable and that can be used, and that I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for. And, a lot of people I talk to don't really give themselves credit for how hard they actually worked and all of the stuff that they did accomplish. And we end up feeling very lost and not knowing what to do. And it's just so important. I think you did such a wonderful job of really distilling down, maybe, the actual work wasn't great, but there's, a lot of benefits that you've learned through that time and through that experience.
Yeah, completely. I think it's very easy to look back, as you said, and picture everything as a sunk cost. But I feel that if you come to a place where you picture yourself as an evolving set of skills that can be applied in many different contexts, then I think you focus on how grateful you are for having been able to develop those skills, even if they weren't in the environment that you particularly wanted to apply them in.
Can you go a little bit deeper about why did you feel like the work was so important? What was the part of that kind of made you, unfulfilled or unhappy in that role?
Sure. I think, the problem with becoming a lawyer is that typically you to pay a lot to go to law school. And so in the UK, at least, one of the ways to get around that debt is that you go into commercial law because commercial law firms, if you're good and they like you, will pay for all of your tuition or most of it.
Oh, wow.
And so that's the contract that you easily fall into. If you're interested in lawyers, you end up in these big commercial firms. I think to get to your answer more specifically, I was working a lot on disputes between national governments around the world and foreign investors into those countries. And more often than not, was representing sort of the corporations when I was perhaps more interested in representing the national governments. And
right.
I won't go into the boring details for everyone else, but in a nutshell, it was to do with how far a government has a right to overrun the commercial rights of foreign investors in order to implement their public policies for their own country, which in itself is a super interesting question. But I think when you're representing the side that you're less excited to represent, or even when you're representing, the side that you want to be representing,
Right.
when your day is 15 hours of extremely meticulous analysis and, turning every stone to make sure there's no risk in the case, you quickly lose a sense of the kind of social impact that, in my case, I was trying to achieve by being a lawyer.
Absolutely. I think a lot of people that maybe aren't lawyers and, through a lot of the kind of TV dramas of law, even outside of criminal law, when you're looking at civil law, or they make it seem like the actual issue might be really exciting, even if you're looking at, like, I remember talking to people and talking about maybe the work that our firm was doing. And yeah, it sounds great. Like you're doing some kind of like big deal with Apple or Facebook or whatever. And it sounds like as a whole, like big picture, sure, it sounds wonderful. But what you're saying is I don't think people realize is that like what your day to day is pouring over 500 pages for like a missing word of and or, like trying to find every possible paragraph that might potentially in 10 years cause some kind of a problem. And it's just so tedious and a lot of pressure. I don't know. It loses its glamour very quickly.
Absolutely. I'm enjoying this mutual therapy session.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So moving on from that. So like, how did you, I mean, obviously, we all kind of got to this point where we were feeling unfulfilled, but like, was there a moment for you? Was it like a slow build where you were starting to look for other things? How did you start realizing like you need to kind of get out of this?
Yeah. So I started law in 2012, and it was really about 2 years later in 2014 that I started really realizing that this could not go on and that I needed to create a new path and use these skills differently. And really the unlock there was a couple of trips I took in 2014. The first one was to Iran and the second one to New Orleans, which for reasons that will become apparent are kind of two places have become very special to me when I think about, my story so far. I think to make a long story short, both of those places showed me what can be done by humans that are in very difficult situations in terms of, redefining themselves, bouncing back from adversity, using what they can offer the world in perhaps unorthodox and slightly creative ways to get around systems that aren't necessarily to everybody's advantage. And I really appreciated just seeing so many, I guess, micro case studies of people hustling, people progressing, people changing their path despite being in a context where, whether it's an authoritarian regime or endemic racism or,
Right.
hurricane threats, people are always in some sort of peril, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as an Iranian American, I have to ask, like, what prompted you, because you don't see a ton of tourism to Iran. So what prompted you to even want to go to Iran?
I think I've always been interested in, cultures of heavy global and historic significance. My roots are half British, half French. And so, those are obviously two cultures that have shaped the world in good and not good ways. And I think I recognized in Iran a very underappreciated, underexplored culture that was kind of one of the 3 or 4 cradles of our global civilizations. And I think I had some time out from being a lawyer for a month. I had a little sabbatical that was offered to everybody at that stage. And my now wife, then girlfriend, was not particularly interested in traveling to the Middle East with me. So I took this trip for myself. And I think just the richness of the culture there as well, just seeing these mosques that have been built over hundreds of years, like reading the translated, works of famous poets from Iran and just appreciating how much this culture can offer the world and how little people, sadly, in the West seem to give it time currently.
One thing that I love that you had this opportunity, and I think for a lot of maybe American lawyers that are listening, it's like, wait, what, a month off? Like, we don't even get, like, nobody even takes 2-week vacations here. And so, and actually, though, a lot of the conversations we've had on the podcast, for so many people, when they took a bit of time off for whatever reason, whether it was a maternity leave, whether it was, they took a sabbatical or they just like burned out and they had to quit. And it was, that space that you give yourself to kind of get away from it that really solidified like, hey, this isn't what I want to be doing. And I think it's so important to have that space to be able to think, because when you're in it and you're surrounded by everyone that's doing it and it seems like just the thing to do and you're crazy for leaving, it's often very difficult to make that decision to want to make a jump.
Totally agree. And just, seeing the inspiration of other people who've had to change their own paths out of choice or not, and recognizing that you don't have to be forever what you thought you were going to be when you were 22.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that. Absolutely. And so do you have, I know you said to make the long story short, we don't have to go super into it, but when you were saying that you're watching people that have kind of dealt with struggle and hardship and have been able to transform themselves or persevere, was there something within these travels that specifically stands out to you? Maybe one example that, had an effect on your decision?
Yeah, I met a bunch of very kind people in Iran and in New Orleans, but I think one example would be a doctor in Iran, and he was extremely qualified. He'd been a medical practitioner for the best part of 20 years. And then I guess he was in his late 40s, and he had decided that actually he was kind of done spending his day listening to people's ailments, not because he didn't care, but because he just felt that there were many other facets to his personality and to his skill set that he wanted to develop before, frankly, it was too late and he was retiring and no longer working. And so he established a completely new business, basically cultivating Iranian food products, Iranian food specialties, and trying to produce the very highest grade versions of each of those, whether it was, saffrons or caviars or, just very high quality fruit and vegetables, and trying to exploit the internal market within Iran for those things, and also to the extent that he could, the global external market. And I just thought, what a cool story from a hyper intelligent man who A, spent the first 20 years of his life helping people with one part of his skill set, and then B, transitioned into this new chapter where he got to express a very different part of himself and have a very different kind of impact on people.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think so often we try to either we do it or society puts us into a box of what we are. And it's just so nice, to see. And I think a lot of the point of this podcast is to show that we are multifaceted people and there are other parts of your personality, and it's okay to explore that or to develop that or to focus on that. But, it's so much easier said than done. I think a lot of people may realize that, but then it's well, this is who I am, so I can't start over. And so for you, I think seeing all this and realizing that you wanted something else, was there ever a thought of maybe I just get another type of legal job? Maybe I can find something with this skill set that I would like more?
I think there was a time in my life where I considered a completely radical change, but remaining a lawyer. And that was to try and move permanently to Louisiana and do death penalty law defense. And I actually, to some extent, tried to make that happen. And just there were too many obstacles in the way. And so it wasn't really possible. But I think I realized that if I was going to stay in law, I needed literally kind of life and death type scenarios to actually warrant doing the aspects of the job that I didn't love. Because, there were aspects I did love. And when I was working these big cases and a lot of the analysis was on the social impact that a company was having in a developing country, that was super interesting to me. It just wasn't the sole crux of the job.
Right. Okay. So once you decide that you want to leave, what did you do next? How did you figure out what you should be doing?
I took some space. So I had 4 years in my law firm, and then I resigned with not much of a clear plan. I traveled a little bit and just spent some time really testing myself, and specifically testing myself on one question, which is there are many, many things that can interest all of us and that interested me. Mm-hmm. But beyond just the things that are of interest, what are my actual sources of motivation? And they can be positive things, or they can frankly sometimes be ugly things like needing appreciation or needing recognition. And so I think I managed to, over a series of months, work out what I was actually motivated by, what mattered to me, and the exact aspects of the legal skill set that I wanted to repurpose into a different format. So that was sort of a lot of thinking. And then, frankly, a lot of just trying things out. So I worked in a couple of investment funds that were making both commercial and social impact investments, because they sort of prized that analytical skill set that I had and the storytelling ability that you have at least as a contentious lawyer. And, I tasted that. I think I settled on strategy consulting in the end because it was just the best fit for my interests, my profile, and for my chronic inability to focus on one topic for more than about 12 months.
And what does a strategy consultant mean?
Strategy consultant is like a management consultant, but focusing really on big sort of organizational or directional shifts. So the strategy consulting that I went into was pure social impact and development. So we work with large foundations around the world or with governments or with global institutions who are trying to radically increase the human impacts of their programs and of their investments, but need a lot of analysis doing on how to do that, where to do it, and why to do it. So that's where we step in.
Interesting. Going back really quickly to what you said about kind of experimenting with a bunch of different roles, I think again, this comes up a lot. And I think this is one of the hardest things for people to grasp when they want to leave, because so often especially when you are a high achiever or, like a type A personality that has always had a path laid out for you, it's very anxiety ridden to think I don't know what's next. And it's really hard to tell people it takes a while to figure that out. It doesn't just happen. Now, it's still worth doing because then in 5 years, 10 years, you will have more of an idea. You will be more on a path that you like. But at the time, it's just so hard to think I might take a year or 2 or 3 of experimenting before I really start figuring out what is true to me and uncovering all of these things about myself. First of all, when you left, I'm assuming that family and friends may have had some opinions about you leaving. And so how did you deal with that? Or in that time, were people saying well, this thing didn't work that you tried? What are you doing? Why don't you go back to law? Or did you ever start feeling maybe I'm not going to figure this out? If, this investment bank stuff didn't work, then maybe I should go back and try it again or find something that works.
I think everybody has those darker moments where you sort of doubt yourself and you worry about the lack of direction and certainty. I think in my case, 2 major thoughts kept me going. The first one was very existential, and it was literally, Marc, you only live once. When you're 75, it's going to be too late. It's going to be too late to try that thing that you wanted to try. And you're just going to look back and you're going to have regret. And I think regret is kind of the absolute poison that threatens us all. So I really wanted to avoid that. I think more practically, I also tried to think in terms of incremental steps. So if I can't get from A to Z in one leap, are there interim experiences that get me closer to where I want to be? Because, if I set out from London walking east 100 steps every day, I will eventually get to China, right? And so that's kind of the narrative I instilled in my mind. And so when in that sort of period between quitting my law firm job, taking the time out, taking these investment fund roles, and also, I should mention in passing, setting up a website called The Great Everything, which was a bit of a passion project. So setting up The Great Everything, I sort of felt that I was continually getting a little bit closer to my kind of so what moment and earning some income along the way. It wasn't lawyer salaries, but it was enough to be perfectly comfortable if you're living frugally. And so they were really my 2 tools that I used to stabilize my mind in that time.
Oh, what a wonderful mindset. I mean, I think that is literally the whole game. If you can get to the point where you realize that you just need to take, a step each day. And that's the thing is those incremental steps, those small 1% changes, that's what changes your life in anything, in any habit you want to create, whether, in any, not just jobs, relationships, weight loss, everything that you want is just small things. And we just want things quickly. It's the entire weight loss industry is on trying to teach you how to do something in 30 days. And it just doesn't work like that. And I think the sooner you can adopt that mindset of if I just take 100 steps, every day, then I'm going to be closer to that goal. It's gold. It's just hard to, get that because we so badly just want to know what, the end result is, where Z is. And the thing is, I think ultimately, you realize there is no Z, right? You're constantly just taking those steps. Even once you get to wherever, quote unquote, there is, then you will want to evolve into something else or add something else or whatnot, because we don't ever Like if you're just staying the same, like you're not really living. And so I think figuring that out though is just like the most amazing mindset that you can have. So it's incredible that you had that at that time.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I completely, echo everything you've just encapsulated. The way I think about it when I sort of do a lot of mentoring now of sort of young leaders in the community and other, unhappy lawyers who are trying to make big professional changes. And the way I sort of frame it in one line is the path of least regret. Like,
I love that.
Just when you think about your options, carve everything else out. What is your path of least regret? Do that, period.
Oh my God, I love that line so much. Okay, so then you were a strategy consultant for a firm in Paris for the last couple of years, and then you've recently moved to the US. So tell us a little bit about how that happened and what your job is now.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was working officially independently in Paris, but in reality, working very much with one firm. So I did that for a couple of years. I was doing a lot of work in Africa, in Francophone Africa, these kind of big strategy refreshes for foundations, and also doing a lot of human-based research to try and better understand how we can reach target populations in areas like health and gender equity and so on. And then I think sort of the work went really well. I had been, working very closely with this firm in the US, and we just decided that we would make that relationship more official and they would hire me as a US employee. So we went through a lengthy immigration process, and I have just relocated to the San Francisco Bay Area as of a few weeks ago with my wife. So it's a really, really happy place to be, and just so many great opportunities in the social impact, philanthropy, impact investing spaces that I'm really excited to just dig into.
That's so incredible. Well, welcome. We are happy to have you. But it's just, again, like, it's so funny. I feel like I just repeat myself all the time on the podcast because everybody's story sort of, we all have the same fears. We all have the same anxieties, and we all have a lot of the paths look the same. And one thing that comes up a lot, and I'm just talking about this, like this job sounds incredible. And I think a lot of people listening would think like, oh my God, like to do this type of work and strategy on such huge scales and to affect change and policy that affects so many people is just such an incredible thing to be a part of, especially like with philanthropies and things that so many people care so deeply about. And yet it's like, I feel like if you were just like looking for jobs on, some job website after you were a lawyer, like you would never come to this point, it's all of these experiments, all of these steps, right? But kind of looking back, and it's funny, you can always connect the dots looking back. But, one thing I want people to realize, again, as we were talking about all these skills that you have, like I'm sure when you were a strategy consultant, like part of the fact that you were a lawyer and you had these skills helps you land these clients and these jobs, and so there's so much more that you can do besides like the traditional what we think you have to do as a lawyer. And I wonder what your thoughts are, like kind of where you have ended up now. I mean, how much of that path has kind of led you there?
Yeah, 100% being a lawyer in a past life has made me a better consultant than I otherwise would have been. I think the rigor, the depth of analysis, the way you frame information into a coherent narrative, all of that really is just super invaluable. I would had a steeper learning curve as a consultant were it not for that prior legal experience, for sure. So yeah, I wouldn't despair to anybody who's listening and thinking, I'm stuck in a dead end, I'm going to be this forever. I really think that there are future chapters in our lives where we can look back and be grateful for the moments we formed our skills that we then applied somewhere else. So yeah, I think about that a lot. For sure.
Yeah. And I know you do. You were saying that you coach young professionals through kind of this process of self-reinvention and purpose seeking and people that want to maybe switch to different careers. So, I mean, what advice do you have for somebody that is where you were as a lawyer and just feeling really stuck, but can't see any path, right? Doesn't know what they should be doing?
Step one, get to a place where your baseline sort of financial needs can be met, and be realistic about what your baseline is versus your nice to haves. So that can be a bit of a difficult conversation with yourself. I think if you don't have a clear path after that, then have a really rigorous, lengthy think about what motivates you. Take jobs out of it, but what do you enjoy devoting your time to and why? And that why can be great things like I want to help people and that's my mission. Or it can be uglier things like I have this complex about not being recognized. And so I need, I want to be in an environment where I get lots of pat on the back and publicity, right? Like that's fine. But just be really real with what you need to thrive. And then if you don't have the clear answer, which is completely, fair, then I think you have to take the leap and try. Because if you don't try, you're immobile. And as you said earlier, if you're immobile, you're not really living. If you have the choice to, be professionally mobile and try something else, you have to give it a go. Otherwise, like I said, you're going to be 70 and it's all going to have been a very jaded blur. I think that's my serious advice. My less serious advice is always stay on good terms with your ex-girlfriends and boyfriends, because I actually found out about my current strategy consulting job, Canva Collective, through an ex-girlfriend that I dated many years prior, who went into this sector, and she happened to become a client of the firm I now work for. And so when the firm was trying to recruit someone, she said, look, I know this is kind of kooky, but there's an ex of mine who really wants to do this. I think he'd be great. Plus, you need a French speaker. Why don't you give him an interview and see where it goes?
Oh my God, I love that. And I think that clearly can expand into, honestly, like, don't burn bridges with anybody. And I think that's great advice. I think some people are maybe going to have a hard time with that with the ex-girlfriend, ex-boyfriends, but that's a very funny twist. And I love your advice. I actually love that you started out with, figuring out the financial baseline, because it's so important. I think so many people stop themselves before they even actually sit down to think about, because they think like, well, I need the salary. And it's like, well, how much of it do you really need? How much can you pare down? Because at the end of the day, like, we buy ourselves these like golden handcuffs, and we're all, miserable in these houses that we don't really spend time in because we're working too much, or with these cars that we don't care about, or whatever all this other stuff is. And I think really having an honest conversation with yourself, your spouse, if you have one, like the family, whatever, to see like, what do I need to make? And I think a lot of times that can be really liberating, because often it might be a lot less than you think it is. And you can start seeing like, hey, if I can live off of this amount, then that opens up a lot of things I can do, because I can make that doing, X, Y, or Z.
Completely agree. You put it so well. We're so powerful as humans at justifying our own inaction, I think, and at creating these narratives in which we always are the prisoner. Mm-hmm. I understand that I've done that many times myself, and sometimes still do. But I think challenging yourself to really, as you said, identify what is crucial and what you can forego for a period of time in order to reach sort of a greater fulfillment is such a critical process. And if people are unwilling to do that, if you start the story with, well, I have a mortgage, therefore I have to be on $250,000 or whatever to justify that mortgage, then you've already lost. If you start the question with, what do I need? Maybe I downsize, as you said, and maybe I sacrifice the salary for 3 months, or I take $50K for 2 years because it's going to get me into a really cool organization, then so many more pathways open up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So why don't you tell us a little bit about, I know you mentioned it, but this passion project that you talked about that you started called The Great Everything. What was that? Like, why did you decide to start it, and what has it turned into?
Great question. Yeah, The Great Everything is very much a passion project that I set up with my closest friend, who was the best man at my wedding recently. And we were both lawyers in the same firm together, both similarly exasperated. And we spent a lot of our therapy time on Sundays and late night in the office just talking about experiences that we thought were really experiences of substance. And that could be, super nerdy stuff like understanding the origins of jazz and, what makes, Miles Davis such an incredible musician, down to why is this donut so much more superior than the donut I had last week, right? And we would have these super big nerd offs about like what defines quality and why some things stand the test of time. And I think we got to a stage where we knew we needed to work out longer term concrete professional plans, but in the short term, we just wanted to spend more time exploring those questions, because aside from being, super pleasurable pursuits, they were also helping us advance our own thinking in terms of what mattered to us and the kinds of things we wanted to share with other people. And so that's what thegreateverything.com was. It started out as a fairly lighthearted blog focused on like food, drink, music, movies, TV. And we've actually just had a super amazing reaction to it in terms of readership and now in terms of listenership, because we have a podcast that my collaborator runs primarily. And we've got opportunities to sort of get it out to a much bigger audience now on bigger platforms. So we are in the midst of a pivot to make it a more structured, I guess, program, for want of a better word, that isn't just an ad hoc exploration of everything that we enjoy and our theories on what's great and what isn't, but it is more of a reflection on like, what are the big 10 questions that every human being faces in the world, irrespective of where or who they are? And how do certain experiences get us closer to the answers to those 10 big questions?
Wow, what a cool blog and like podcast. I mean, I'm going to check it out and I think everybody should. What is the podcast called? The Great Everything as well?
Yep, the podcast is called The Great Everything. The website is thegreateverything.com. We are in the midst of a very major pivot, so content is a little bit on hiatus, but we'll be back before long.
No, but I love that. Again, like I know, like I've been broken record and we've said this before, but you know, I'm right now working in a small group program with a number of people that listen to the podcast and that are going through starting their own transformational journeys and switching careers. And one thing that, you know, I see constantly is that like, and I was like this in the beginning too, it's like you want to think your way to the end. You want to figure out what that, you know, what the final product is going to look like and how it's going to ultimately, like what's going to be the best version of it. And again, it doesn't work like that. It's like taking steps. And I love that you're saying like you guys have been doing this for a couple of years and now like there's always room to rebrand and pivot and see where things are going. But like if you don't start it, you would have never gotten to this place where you're going to have a, you know, complete rebrand and figure out what those top 10 questions are because you gave yourself permission to experiment. And I think that's just like my main takeaway I want people to understand from this podcast is like, just give yourself the space to try things, you know, but we get so in our head about making it right and making it perfect and what people will think that we stop ourselves before we ever even start.
Yeah, very much so. And I think just your work and your podcast here is also such a great, inspiring example of that. You know, I remember your early episodes that were you know, kind of off the cuff and super interesting, but a different format. And now you've got events, you've got, you know, themes, you've got, I'm sure, all kinds of ideas on how to grow this out. And like, that's just from your hustle, as I understand it. So it's as good an example as any.
Oh, thank you. Yes. I mean, I'm hoping to put myself out there as like the main example that I'm still figuring all of this out. Like I wish people knew how little I feel equipped to be doing this, but it's just like, I kind of came to a place where it's like, I don't care. I'm just going to put it out there and see what happens. And I've just learned so much that this is really the path because like, if anything is going to come of it, if anything is going to grow from it, if I'm going to grow into whatever I'm going to be, you know, in 5 years or 10 years, it's just by taking those steps and not like sitting and waiting for it to happen.
Yep. So true.
I love that. Well, Marc, this has been very helpful, very insightful. Thank you so much for being here. I know we've already asked you like your advice. Is there anything else? Are there any like books that helped you or any resources or maybe just some additional parting words that you might have for people that are kind of in that beginning stage of these transformations?
Yeah, completely. I mean, I think the first thing I would say is people dismiss career coaches very easily. And I understand why, because I used to do the same. I think as somebody who now sort of provides a light touch version of those services to a whole bunch of people, it can be really helpful to get an impartial external, you know, party to bounce ideas with and to help you structure your interests, your future direction and your opportunities a little bit. Otherwise, it can be quite a lonely process. So I think one, being open to that external help, whether it's from a coach or just a significant other or a friend that you really trust. I really learned a lot from somebody called Gary Vaynerchuk, or Gary V, I think, in America. So I don't know how many listeners will be familiar with him, but he started out as someone who grew a tiny business into a huge business and really morphed into this kind of big life coach who gets very real very quick about what your priorities should be and how to not live a life you'll regret, essentially. And so, Gary V would be my, go-to resource for a kick up the backside.
That's so funny because he was actually one of the first people that I started following when I was going through this transition, and he was definitely the kick in the pants that I needed. And not everyone will like his style. He's very brash, curses a lot, but I actually like it because I like the no fluff, like just give it to them straight. And he is a great example of someone to follow because he really just embodies the like not caring what anyone else thinks and doing the thing that he wants and constantly transforming the businesses he has and the things that he's doing. So that is a great one. Thank you so much, Marc. I really appreciate you being here. Where can people find you if they want to get in touch, if maybe they want some coaching, if they just want to follow along on what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to speak sort of one-to-one, not necessarily for coaching, but just to bounce ideas around on future careers, especially if you're an ex-lawyer, then you can find me on LinkedIn, actually, Marc Allen, MarcAllen. My employer is Canva Collective, so you'll find me there. If you're interested in my theory of what the 10 questions are that face every human, then thegreateverything.com before long will be devoted to that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marc.
Thank you. It's been great.
How great was Marc? Here are my 3 takeaways. 1, we all have so many facets to our personalities. I don't know why we try to pigeonhole ourselves as one thing, and then we feel stuck and claustrophobic. And the reality of it is that there are so many different aspects to each of our personalities, and it's okay to decide that you're going to pursue one of the other things that you find interesting. 2, I love that he said the path of least regret. If you look back in 75 years, what will you think? That's just a great question to really start focusing on what's important and get over all of the fears and BS excuses that you come up with, because things will be really real when you look back and wish you had done something that you have the opportunity to do now. And 3, think about what motivates you, all of the good and the bad. I love that he raised this because so often there are things that we consider bad or are kind of ashamed to admit are really important to us. And the more honest you can be with yourself, the more likely you're going to find the next thing that is actually going to be fulfilling with you. So just think about, in a very honest way, what are the things that drive you, and try to find a career that incorporates those. I hope you liked this episode. I will be back next week with another one. Thank you so much for listening. I can't tell you how much it means to me. If you liked the podcast, please rate and review us on iTunes. It'll help other people find the show. If you want to connect or reach out, follow along on Instagram and Facebook at Lessons from a Quitter, and on Twitter at Quitter Podcast. I would love to hear from you guys, and I'll see you on the next episode.